about how the rest of the world views us. A kind of global sniper politics. They are experiencing, terrified. Who's next? First Afghanistan, then we slam a missile into Yemen, then you've got Iraq, but even before we invade Iraq, we're saying North Korea, Syria, and Iran. A kind of global sniper politics. Chomsky says the way a powerful country exerts its power not by being rational, but by being irrational. You don't know who's next.
Few challenges facing our democracy are more urgent and deserving of citizen attention than those involving the ownership, management, governance, and use of the major media in this country. I'm Larry Hansen, Vice President of the Joyce Foundation. In conjunction with CAN TV, we are pleased to bring you the following coverage of the National Conference on Media Reform. Political and community leaders, journalists, educators, and media activists from around the country gathered in Madison, Wisconsin in the fall of 2003 in response to the call to transform the media into a force that supports democracy and the public interest. We hope that this coverage helps to inform your understanding of this important issue.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nancy Snow, and I'm assistant professor. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mom. And I appreciate so much the weather, despite my name. I live in Southern California, and I'm a bit bundled up. My very thick jacket is in the back. I teach at Cal State Fullerton and also the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Southern California. And I am moderating today's panel, and I want to give our panelists as much time as possible. I would add that I may be the only one on today's panel who, like the old teenage flick, I was a teenage werewolf. In my case, I was a government propagandist. And I worked at the U.S. Information Agency in the State Department. We did not call what we did propaganda. We have a euphemism for propaganda, which is public diplomacy. And you laugh, right? And you may have heard that Charlotte Beers was the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, now to be replaced by Margaret Tutwiler, a name which may sound familiar to you. She worked very closely with James Baker in the spinning of the Florida election in 2000. She's also just a returning ambassador from Morocco, a very seasoned veteran from the Bush 1 administration, so look for that name. And propaganda, again, just to put out a definition for us, it varies. In the United States, of course, we tend not to use the term, and it wasn't until the events of 9/11 that we suddenly awakened to the idea that, guess what, the United States is not immune from conducting its own propaganda. And I would remind our audience that worldwide, the U.S. continues to be seen as the #1 manufacturer of propaganda in the world, namely in terms of its advertising, public relations, mass marketing of the image of the United States, but also our U.S. government is seen as very much at the top of the list in manufacturing propaganda. Just another reminder, as kind of a scholar of propaganda, when I worked at the agency, and this was 9 years ago is when I left in late '94, we could not then share any of our propaganda materials with the American people. And there's a reason for that. It's called the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, and it has not changed. It's still on the books, and it prohibits the American people from being propagandized by the U.S. government. So you may think, I am trying to work with many people now to overturn the Smith-Mundt Act, because in the age of global media, in the age of the internet, it has become, of course, a very antiquated concept that the U.S. government cannot propagandize its own people. And I think we need, certainly, more transparency. Just very quickly, to kick us off here, I want to share a few quotes to keep in mind. This is from the foreword to my book that's coming out next year, and it's from the great Ben Bagdikian. It's from the book War, Media, and Propaganda, A Global Perspective. And he writes in the foreword, "It was Senator Hiram Johnson who in 1917 arguing argued before the Senate against U.S. entry into World War I, and he said then, the first casualty when war comes is truth. It was I.F. Stone who told a group of aspiring journalists, the first thing you need to understand in covering politics is that all governments lie. And more than 50 years ago, it was Gordon Allport with his Harvard associates in the study of riots who found that when there are rumors, panic, or propaganda that induce anxiety and fear, the best antidote is not silence or mere comforting words or propaganda from the authorities, but to the contrary, as much solid and accurate information as possible. So I want to thank those of you who are here. I want to thank the organizers of this National Conference on Media Reform, because it is at events like this where we are creating antidotes against the harmful propaganda of the age. Now let me move on very quickly so that we'll have time for Q&A. And I want to introduce our very distinguished panel with us this afternoon. Amy Goodman. We know her as the host of Democracy Now! She began her career in community radio in 1985 at Pacifica Radio's New York station, WBAI. She produced WBAI's Evening News for 10 years. In 1990 and 91, Amy traveled to East Timor to report on the U.S.-backed Indonesian occupation of East Timor. There, she and colleague Alan Nairn witnessed Indonesian soldiers gun down 270 East Timorese. Indonesian soldiers beat Amy and Alan, fracturing Alan's skull. Their documentary, Massacre, The Story of East Timor, won numerous awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy Prize for International Reporting, the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Silver Baton, the Armstrong Award, and the list goes on and on. In 1996, Amy helped launch Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! 2 years later, Amy and producer Jeremy Scahill went to Nigeria. Their radio documentary, Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship, exposed Chevron's role in the killing of 2 Nigerian villagers in the Niger Delta who were protesting yet another oil spill in their community. That documentary won the George Polk Award, the Golden Reel for Best National Documentary from the National Federation of Community Broadcasters, and a Project Censored Award. I introduce, no, not right now, okay. Let me go down the panel then. Let's get all our introductions out of the way. I would like to introduce here to my immediate left, or your immediate right, Rahul Mahajan from the United for Peace and Justice. He just received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Isn't that George W. Bush's backyard? Watch this guy. He's a founding member of the No War Collective and serves on the National Board of Peace Action and the Administrative Committee of United for Peace and Justice. His first book, The New Crusade, there's that word, America's War on Terrorism, from Monthly Review Press, covered issues from the war on Afghanistan to the Patriot Act and racial profiling to media coverage of the war. It has been described as mandatory reading for anyone who wants to get a handle on the war on terrorism. His latest book is from Seven Stories Press, Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Rahul writes frequently for mainstream and alternative media, and including The Hindu, the Houston Chronicle, the Jordan Times, and the Mideast Times. His work is collected at rahulmahajan.com. And John Stauber, our third panelist today, from the Center for Media and Democracy. John Stauber is an investigative writer, public speaker, and democracy activist. He founded the Center for Media and Democracy 10 years ago, and it remains the only public interest organization dedicated to the unique mission of investigating and exposing organized corporate and government propaganda campaigns. Since high school, I won't say what decade, John, in the 1960s, John has worked with public interest, peace, consumer, family farm, environmental, and community organizations at the local, state, and national levels. He writes for various publications, including the Center's quarterly news magazine, PR Watch, which we all know so well. With his colleague Sheldon Rampton, he has co-authored Toxic Sludge is Good for You. Who knew? Trust us, we're experts, how industry manipulates science and gambles with your future, and the 2003 New York Times bestseller, Weapons of Mass Deception, The Uses of Propaganda in Bush's War on Iraq. Welcome, panelists. And I would like to first invite Amy up to the, John, Raul? Okay, I'll speak. I'm just going to keep speaking. All right, thank you, Raul.
Okay, can everyone hear me? No, okay. Is this better? Yes. All right. I have some handouts here. Unfortunately, I could not afford to make copies for the whole class. I hope you share. If someone can come up and grab them and so we can pass them around. I'm launching a new website. I'll get one for myself. A new website, empirenotes.org, and what's on the handout here is a taste of what you'll be seeing there once it gets launched next week. I'm gonna go through. I've been told that this is supposed to be very action-oriented, and I'm sure all of the other talks will be very action-oriented. So I'll do some analysis and see if we can bring it to action at the end. To start with, the panel is called Media Coverage in Wartime, I believe. And I want to state from the outset that I think this is something I agree with the Bush administration on. I agree that ever since 9/11, we've been in wartime. There's been ups and downs. There's been more intense periods of war and less intense periods of war, but I'd characterize it all as wartime. And the reason that I agree with them there is that I agree with them on another thing as well. Their oft-stated claim that a small band of fanatical men, has declared a war on civilization because they hate us for our freedoms. And so I'm going to talk about a whole range of things, some things which were covered a lot in the media, some things which were covered almost not at all. The common thread is only this. The media coverage, whether there was a lot, whether there was a little, whether there was good investigation, whether there wasn't, was not sufficient to enable you to understand what's going on. It was misleading, or it was just not enough, and so at the end of the day, people still don't get it. I'll start with one. Bush administration lies about weapons of mass destruction and the threat from Iraq. This has absolutely been done to death, right? I mean, there's been more stuff written on this than you can keep track of. There are entire books on this subject right now, but there's two major problems with it. First, the timing. Almost everything, not all the details, but almost everything in broad strokes was known before the war. All right? On March 8th, the story about the Niger, Iraq getting uranium from Niger, on March 8th, the Chicago Tribune had a story saying this was nonsense, that these were based on forgeries. You already seen claims from IAEA inspectors that they were forgeries that could be debunked by a 10-year-old kid with a couple hours on Google, right? It wasn't covered then. It wasn't newsworthy then. There was a handful of articles. Why wasn't it newsworthy? Because it could have made a difference then. Just like in the 2000 elections, the disenfranchisement of 58,000 voters in Florida was not newsworthy in November and December. It was news only next June, 6 months later, when it couldn't have made a difference. And the same thing with this. It blew open in the summer after the war, after the United States is already in there in Iraq. Second, the coverage has basically been such that any kind of obfuscation is allowed. And so the administration has said, yes, there were some mistakes, but has always tried to cast them as intelligence failures. There's at least twice, maybe 3 times, they have tried to make George Tenet throw himself on his sword or hang himself from his tie or whatever it is these guys are supposed to do. Or they've made it out to be mistakes that were because of goodwill. They had a good intention to go in and liberate Iraq, and they made a few mistakes. All right? I can't go into all of this, but this has been basically their idea, and it's working so far because of the media coverage. A recent poll, this is an amazing statistic. Think about this through the whole rest of the weekend. 59% of Americans think that George Bush is honest and trustworthy. Well, I believe it. I don't know what it means, but I believe it. Second, the Bush administration never tried diplomacy. This is something you simply don't hear. Just yesterday in the New York Times, it was reported that Iraq made a desperate last-ditch attempt to stave off the war, and saying that they would do whatever. You want oil, we'll give you oil. You want weapons of mass destruction? Well, we really, really don't have any, as we've been saying for a decade now. And the Bush administration, of course, completely ignored it. This is news, but it's not new news. We knew already that they were bent on war no matter what and wouldn't give Iraq a chance to back down. This summer, Lieutenant General Michael Mosley of the Air Force admitted that the so-called no-fly zone bombings in late 2002 were basically the first stage of a war. That over 600 sorties hit near 400 predetermined targets, which were command and control and air defense, the first stages in a war. That tells you something. That tells you that they were at war while they went through this charade of inspections and negotiations. They were already at war. They're not going to stop in the middle of a war. But worse than that, we knew before the war. In The Guardian, it was actually published last December that this was the first stage of a war. I'm going to skip down some of these. Another one that was completely, almost totally undercovered. Iraqi civilian deaths in the war. They'll have individual cases. They'll mention a story about a few people, and then they'll say things like, well, this bomb that fell, it might have been Iraqis shooting up and falling into a marketplace, or, well, we can't actually go and look at the shell casings and figure it out. That's only for people like Robert Fisk to do. But they never had any coverage of how many people were killed. People have no idea. 6 weeks into the Afghanistan war, an LA Times columnist wrote, several dozen civilians may have been killed. At that time, it was about 3,000. It's like saying 60,000 Jews may have been killed in the Holocaust. That's the level of imbalance, and that's the case with the reporting on Iraq as well. The occupation, the fact that on numerous occasions, the United States has fired into crowds of peaceful demonstrators, killing large numbers, 13 in Baghdad, 13 in Mosul, 15 in Fallujah on April 28th. When they did this, this is serious, this is gigantic. If this was done in a typical police state, in Colombia, the whole country would be up in arms. The whole international community would be up in arms. In Turkey, again, it would be a gigantic story. Even if it was done in Israel, it would be a big story. But the United States does it in Iraq, and it passes almost without notice. They gave the same excuse that police states always do. They said there was firing from the crowd. Well, on this occasion, Human Rights Watch went in and investigated, found no firing. And only now, 6 months later, when the American death toll is mounting towards 400, are we starting to see stories that maybe this massacre and others like it have something to do with the fact that Fallujah is the most ungovernable part of Iraq for the United States even to this day. Another one. You'd think the media would want to cover this. There is press censorship in Iraq. The Coalition Provisional Authority gives 9 different reasons to shut down a publication. Over 100 new publications have sprung up since Saddam came down, but they reinstituted censorship because there was too much public debate. The Reporters Without Borders recently did a survey. It said the United States ranked tied for 31st in the world in press freedom, not exactly something to beat your chest about, although I'm sure there are those who will. But the United States and Iraq ranked 135th in the world in terms of press freedom. Israel and the occupied territories actually was a little bit lower. Completely uncovered. People don't realize there is press censorship in Iraq. Composition of the Iraqi resistance, they still try to tell us it's Ba'athist dead-enders. It's foreign terrorists. There are already numerous articles with interviews of people who are fighting in the Iraqi resistance. There was one in the San Francisco Chronicle where the guy said he's an anti-Ba'athist, he was against Saddam, and for him the last straw, what made him pick up a gun, was the Fallujah massacre. Not a big surprise, and there are many stories like that. But you see a couple of these things and they never get repeated. Only the people who happen to be reading that newspaper that day, or the people who have incredible memories, know this, and everybody else doesn't. The sham of democracy in Afghanistan. There was an election in Chechnya recently, an interesting election. Ahmad Kadyrov was handpicked by Moscow as the man, and 3 other candidates who were polling higher than Kadyrov were removed one way or another, disqualified. One of them was chosen to be Yeltsin's aide and therefore withdrew. And all of the ones who were well known were taken out of the election, and then, miracle of miracles, Kadyrov won. The United States did the same thing in Afghanistan with the Loya Jirga, removed Zahir Shah, pressured him for 2 days to tender his resignation as a candidate, and that was a great victory for democracy. I've got 1 minute left. 2 things very quickly. The Palestinians are under siege. This is the big story in Palestine, not the back and forth violence. There are 2 UN reports, the Bertini report and the Ziegler report, which show that 22% of Palestinian children are malnourished, 1.5 million dependent on food aid. Over 50% of Palestinians eat 1 meal a day, some of them living on bread and tea alone. 60% are in acute poverty. Both of these reports, take them together. In the last year, there's been 1 article in 1 American newspaper, the Boston Globe, about them. This is shattering. This is a tragedy. And finally, U.S. involvement in the attempt to unseat Hugo Chavez. You remember Hugo Chavez, the hated military dictator in Venezuela, who somehow was so hated that when he was taken out in a coup, the people rose up and put him back in power? Well, the Times said that this was a victory for democracy when Hugo Chavez was removed. Later, it was forced to reverse itself, and we found out quickly the United States was involved in the coup. It funded the coup. U.S. administration officials met with coup plotters beforehand. We have a couple of stories about that, but in the next stage, when they try to unseat Chavez in December of 2002, no coverage, no institutional memory, no idea that nobody says Chavez, who the United States tried to remove before because he imperiled their plans for global oil dominance. That somehow doesn't get into the media. These are the kinds of things we have to look at, not just the propaganda, not just what doesn't go covered at all, but what doesn't get explained properly. And I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
First of all, my name is John Stauber. I'm with Center for Media and Democracy for the last 10 years. Sheldon Rampton, Laura Miller, Margot Robb, and I have been running PR Watch. And for the last few years, you can go up to our website at prwatch.org and follow our Spin of the Day, which we send out as a listserv called Spin of the Week. And you can stay abreast of our coverage of propaganda here in the United States. And until we started PR Watch 10 years ago, it was very frustrating for me because there wasn't any organization like ours that actually reported on propaganda here in the United States. And of course, that's because we have no propaganda in the United States. We are a country with a free press, a First Amendment, skeptical, well-educated citizens, and propaganda would never work here. It could never possibly work here. That's something from Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia. Of course, as you know, in fact, it's in countries like the United States where there is the most propaganda, and the academics who look at our news on a good day, find that 40% or more of whatever we're getting, seeing, hearing, reading from the mainstream news media is the result of organized propaganda campaigns, which we give polite terms to like public relations or public affairs. This is never more true than when it comes to a country at war. In fact, propaganda, the industry of public relations, was born out of World War I and the Wilson administration's efforts to sell that war. Ever since 9/11 and the terrorist attacks, we've seen actually the story, I would argue, of 2 hijackings. The first hijacking were the planes that struck New York and Washington, D.C., the terror attacks of 9/11. The second hijacking were the terror attacks of 9/12, when Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and the other founders of the Project for a New American Century exploited the war on terror they had declared to turn it into the war on Iraq. And here we are. You can turn on Fox News Channel, which is where most Americans are getting most of their news, apparently, about the war on terror, and you will see the war on Iraq covered as the war on terror. This is, of course, the ultimate lie. This war could have never taken place had it not been for the complicity of the news media. In our book, Weapons of Mass Deception, we go into that in great detail. Not everything the corporate media does is bad. For instance, our book is from a major corporate publisher, and they rushed this book out so that it would be in the middle of the debate this past summer over things like, where are the weapons of mass destruction? Why is there no evidence that Saddam was behind al-Qaeda? But what we found when the book came out was we ran into exactly what the critics of the war, the anti-war movement, the tens of millions of us who were in the streets ran into during the so-called run-up to war. The media that sold this war doesn't want to examine how they did it. And so while our book has actually become a legitimate New York Times bestseller, it hasn't been reviewed in the New York Times. The only paper in the U.S. of the 100 largest papers that have reviewed it, or the San Francisco Chronicle, we have gotten less media attention on our best-selling book than any of our other books combined. I'm happy to report that in other countries they do have a different sort of media, so I just learned that it's the best-selling book on the Iraq War in Britain. Thank you. It's just, but I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to be short because I want Amy to have plenty of time, and then we want to have some Q&A. I just want to really make one point. If you want to keep abreast of propaganda, the best thing you can do, and I'm sorry if this sounds too self-serving, but sign up for our Spin of the Week at prwatch.org. We don't write it all, we link to it. So when Amy does an incredible story, ripping apart the latest Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld lies on the Tim Russert Show, we link to that, and you can get it, and we wrap it all up, and we bundle it with the dozen or so best exposés of propaganda, and a lot of that now is on the war. And the bottom line here is we've got to figure out how to disabuse our fellow citizens, tens of millions of whom made the fatal mistake of trusting George Bush and believing these lies and supporting the war, of these horrible misconceptions they have. In September, right around the time George Bush himself was forced by international pressure to admit that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. There's not a shred of evidence to support that contention. Polls were showing that 70% of Americans still believe Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, and it just rips my guts out to see families of dead servicemen and women from the U.S. saying, well, we weren't sure about this war, but they wanted to go over there because of 9/11. And don't leave it up to the Democratic candidates to change public opinion. Don't. I'll just say that whatever happens to destroy this veil of propaganda that's been pulled, this mask of propaganda that's been pulled over the eyes of the American people, however public opinion changes, is going to be the direct result of everything done by everyone in this room and your organizations. Thank you.
It is absolutely critical that we break the sound barrier, that we demand of publishing in this country, that they start publishing books like these. And the only way we can make that demand is if we show them that there are people out there who are hungry for this information. The right-wing imprints of the mainstream publishers are proliferating right now. And we have to prove, because we know that we are not the fringe minority or the silent majority. We are the silenced majority, silenced by the mainstream media. And we're not going to be silenced any longer. I want to acknowledge my colleagues here from Democracy Now! Anna Noguera is at the camera, and Mike Burke is at the back, and he's with Dennis Moynihan, and they're handing out email lists to pass around, and I hope all your groups are doing this throughout the weekend, because I think most importantly this weekend it is about networking, linking up with each other, because this is an absolutely critical year. They'll be sending around email lists so that you can sign up for Democracy Now!'s Daily Digest. It lets you know the stories that we're breaking and the other issues that we're covering when we interview, for example, our guests like those here who we thought we would be having to, well, get in line when they came to New York, that they'd be over at NBC, ABC, CBS. We were sorry that we are among the only ones interviewing them, but not really, because right now we are engaged in the largest public media collaboration in this country. Democracy Now! Several years ago was broadcasting on several dozen community radio stations. Now, over 170 Pacifica radio stations, community stations, NPR stations. There's a movement underfoot in almost every state now to get us on NPR stations, and dozens of them have already brought us on board. We are no longer We are also broadcasting on public access TV stations around the country. Democracy Now! Is both TV and radio. You can get us in your community just by asking. If we don't use this media, public access TV, we will lose it. The monopolies come into a town, either Cablevision or Adelphia or Comcast or AOL Time Warner, any of them. They rip up the streets. They get a monopoly because the town doesn't want it ripped up more than once to put in the cable. They negotiate that they will give a public interest channel or two, and then they hope that in the renegotiation process, no one quite realizes that channel was given, and they can take them right back. Well, they won't be able to if there are constituencies, if there is good programming out there, if people are demanding that throughout the day they are able to make their own media. So we must use public access TV. It is extremely valuable. We're also broadcasting on Free Speech TV, which is channel 9415 on Dish Network. It's the oldest progressive nonprofit TV channel in this country, bringing all of this media together, as well as on the internet, democracynow.org, video and audio streaming. And by the way, today at 5 o'clock, I see Steve Pierce in the audience, Elizabeth Press and Jeremy Scahill are also here. Juan Gonzalez, also co-host on Democracy Now!, and Don Rojas, the new general manager at WBAI, will be at Humanities Building 2650. Will be debuting independent media in a time of war, a collaboration between Democracy Now! And the Hudson Mohawk Indie Media Center. Indie media is so important in this country right now. And that's at 5 o'clock. This past Sunday, for the first time, we saw a coffin on the front page of the New York Times. The picture that George Bush does not want you to see. It's interesting, this morning I heard on NPR, which just got $200 million from McDonald's, but this morning I just heard on NPR a commentary, a very poignant commentary of a woman who lost her son in Iraq. And she talked about how she didn't want the cameras at her house when she and her family were grieving, and yet they were taking pictures of her garage and her door. The one time she was prepared was when her son's coffin was brought home. And each member of her family who was in the military brought out their uniforms, and they were going to be there proudly for their son, for their cousin, for their nephew, to honor that he had died for his country. And she said, there were no cameras there, though. Only the one military camera that videotaped them. What wasn't said, and I believe was the case, based on a memo that was given out just before the Persian Gulf War from the Pentagon, was that it is the Bush administration that is not allowing the videotaping or the photographing of coffins coming home, either at Ramstein base in Germany or at Dover in Delaware, because they understand the power of those images. And now you have a situation where more servicemen and women who have died since the, quote, major hostilities ended in Iraq than before. You have a situation where all those in independent media in this country who were talking about this before the invasion what this invasion means for servicemen and women here and for the Iraqi people. Hundreds of soldiers have died. How many thousands of Iraqis have died? We don't know the numbers because, well, General Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, and we do have to ask why we have a general as Secretary of State, but General Colin Powell said it well in the Persian Gulf War when he said, "We don't count the enemy dead. I don't consider a little Iraqi girl or boy dead on the ground my enemy." And I don't think most people in this country do either. But the counts are being done. We're trying to get word out because in the same way that the American public will not countenance U.S. service men and women coming home in body bags, there's a new word for them the Bush administration has come up with. Someone remembers what it is, something tubes. Transfer tubes. They're changing the language as well as trying to black out the pictures. Transfer tubes. We have to pull down those curtains around the harsh reality, the ugly images of war. Because if we saw for a week in this country what the rest of the world saw during war, and I'm not just talking Al Jazeera, I'm talking about the difference between CNN domestic and CNN international. The day that the day that the statue of Saddam Hussein was being pulled down and then went up again, being pulled down, somehow went up again, all through the day on CNN and all the networks. On CNN International, they had a split screen. Yes, they showed that soldier. They showed the Saddam Hussein statue. I'm confusing it with the soldiers, the US soldiers that pulled him down, but the statue going down and up, but the other half were the casualties of war. You have the same company understanding well what they want to feed for domestic consumption and what the rest of the world demands. That's what Noam Chomsky calls manufacturing consent. Those images are critical because if for 1 week we saw the pictures of the child with his limbs sheared off, of the woman holding her dead infant, of the old man on the ground, if for 1 week we saw as many of those images, even 100th of the number of actual casualties in Iraq, I think war would be abolished. We are the #1 superpower. We are the one that has more military might than any other country in the world. And so we determine whether there will be an invasion. And if the American people saw this, Americans are compassionate. After 9/11, when those polls were done, don't ask me what people were asked or what person was asked. When the news personalities, you can't call them journalists, kept intoning that 90% figure, 90% of people are for war, 90% of Americans are for war. What was the question asked? Because if the question was asked, do you believe the killing of innocent civilians should be avenged by the killing of innocent civilians, more than 90% of Americans would have said no. I come from New York. George Pataki is our governor. He wants to take a piece of the Saddam Hussein statue from Baghdad and incorporate it into the foundation of the new World Trade Center. If in fact that happens, it will be the first proven link between 9/11 and Iraq. This is an absolutely critical weekend. It is amazing. When the New York Times covered one of the first big protests in Washington, said only a couple thousand people turned out, even though there were between 150,000 and 200,000 people. Pacifica was there, broadcasting, C-SPAN was there, so they couldn't deny it. If only someone had taken the phone number that one young man was giving out all through that protest, the phone number of the New York Times, say, tell them we're here, tell them we're here, call them up. Here was the New York Times saying just a couple thousand people had turned out even though the sun had come up, and that the protesters were disappointed by the numbers. 3 days later, they have a new piece, equally large, saying between 100,000 and 200,000 people had turned out, and the organizers were overwhelmed because they expected 30 buses, and in fact, something like 600 buses from around the country had come into Washington. They were forced to correct that earlier article because people demanded it. It is not only important to march on the Pentagon in a time of war and let the public institutions know. It is important to go to the places of the most powerful corporations on earth. They are not only among the wealthiest, the media, but they are the most powerful because they are the way through which we experience the rest of the world, unless we come from another place and are hearing from other sources, and it is the way the rest of the world experiences us. And it is through a corporate lens that the rest of the world sees us. Right now, the sniper trial is going on. I think back to when the snipers were on the East Coast, and they were on the loose. Millions of people hunkered down, terrified that they might be the next victim. It almost closed down parts of the East Coast. The snipers were out. It was the time that George Bush was giving his speech at the United Nations. The next day I went to the newsstand and I saw the tabloids, two headlines. One said, "Who's next?" and the other said, "I am God." I thought, my God, the tabloids have got it right. They're covering George Bush's speech, but no. That was the playing card that the sniper had left, and who's next? Of course, people terrified who would be next. Think about how the rest of the world views us. A kind of global sniper politics they are experiencing, terrified. Who's next? First Afghanistan, then we slam a missile into Yemen, then you've got Iraq, but even before we invade Iraq, we're saying North Korea, Syria, and Iran. A kind of global sniper politics. Chomsky says the way a powerful country exerts its power not by being rational, but by being irrational. You don't know who's next. A man who is not popularly elected president is in the White House, yes, the resident, and this man who is not elected president has declared war on the world. He is destabilizing the world. This is a critical year, and it is not only important to have a massive grassroots movement in this country and around the world. One friend from Guyana said to me, we should all be able to vote for the President of the United States because that person affects populations around the world more than any other. But it is not just enough for there to be grassroots movements that come together. They need a grassroots media, and that is what we are here for this weekend, to build. Congratulations for coming out. I think it is fair to say that the organizers have been overwhelmed by the response this weekend. It is a very serious wake-up call for those in Washington, and I am sure they are paying attention. To those of you who are taking notes, take them carefully, because there is a grassroots movement that is growing. The son of General Colin Powell, Michael Powell, can also tell you about that movement. Millions of people are fighting back, and if we don't take back the media, then the rest of the world is in very serious jeopardy, not to mention all of us here at home. Yes, lies take lives. We must decode those lies. Together this weekend and through this year, we have to make a decision, and that is whether to be the sword or the shield. You decide.
got time, a few more minutes left for questions. I just want to underscore what Amy just shared with you and share another perspective, and that is that as an academic, I can tell you not only will Michael Powell be paying close attention to this, but there are a number of this conference, but there are a number of organizations in Washington, D.C. that are spending full time on the attack and going after leftists, liberals, and academia who are trying to teach critical thinking in the classroom. And those of us who are trying to bridge academia with activism are really coming under greater scrutiny. And so we who are in academia, I appreciate very much hearing from my activist friends, and I'm doing everything I can to try to bridge that barrier. But the right is very well organized in looking at campuses, including this one here, as a bastion of liberalism and leftism, and are doing, but it is certainly, and they're casting it under a frame of being un-American and unpatriotic, and we really need to pay very close attention to how our universities are coming under attack. Furthermore, I just want to share with you, CBS News just pulled its Reagan miniseries from its lineup on its regular network. Now, it will air on its Viacom parent Showtime. But why did they pull it? They pulled it because the right is organized on media, all things media and propaganda. Where is the left, or whatever you want to call yourselves, independents, upwingers, we have different phrases, but those of us who are trying to speak to truth and conscience, we need to be at the table too. And I think we need to do a letter writing campaign, perhaps beginning Sunday night, when Jessica Lynch's story will air opposite the Elizabeth Smart story. This is what our major media are giving us. I'm a Soldier Too, where we're not even sure what the truth is there. We need to write letters to these corporate media companies and not just shake our heads and say, well, I've given up TV long ago, because the eyeballs are still watching TV, and we need to really build up a mass movement. So without further ado, are there a few of you here in the audience? I may have to repeat the question. If you could keep it very short, and if it's directed at anybody in particular. Why is corporate media so complicit with the propaganda machines? I think John can probably speak to that.
Well, I think two things. Why is the corporate media complicit? And in a time of war, as Herman Goering pointed out, it's easy for any country to rally to its side the media. And, the 3,000 deaths on 9/11 allowed Fox and other right-wing media to really wrap themselves in the flag, create what's called the Fox effect, and define how the war on terror would be defined and would be covered. But apart from the war, if you look at the corporate media, where does its money come from? The Fortune 500. There's no way they're going to air news and information, public affairs programming that steps on the toes of their corporate advertisers. They practice massive self-censorship. They're huge corporations themselves. They want to curry favor with the government. And as everyone in this room knows, real journalism costs money. It takes risks. It even takes personal risks. It's much easier to take press releases, video news releases, cover publicity events, promote yourself, than do real journalism. So there are real simple answers to that, but unfortunately the media doesn't report that.
Another question? Yes, right up here.
The question is how to frame the dealing with NPR. Are they friends or adversaries? And once again saying that they have just gotten this huge gift from the Kroc family of $200 million. I think we have to go back to where public media came from. Look at Pacifica Radio, founded in 1949 by war resistors who said no to a media that is run by corporations that profit from war, and yes to a media that is run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was founded, and it pioneered the idea of listener sponsorship, not turning to corporations, but saying to the listeners, if you appreciate what you hear, give something. truly democratic media. NPR, when it was founded, you know, I was just at an NPR station in California that airs Democracy Now!, and the program director told me that the first broadcast of National Public Radio was at a peace march in Washington. I think that the P in NPR matters. It is public. And remember, unlike Pacifica Radio that owns 5 stations and puts out programming to community radio stations around the country, NPR doesn't own stations. They're community radio stations or university radio stations that run NPR programs, but also can run any other program. You can ask them, for example, a whole Democracy Now! Campaign, we want our Democracy Now! But in every state where there is a we want our Democracy Now! Movement to get on public radio, it's coming from the grassroots, and it is a very important message, that dialogue that is taking place now in state after state. And that is telling those in management at NPR, we want something else. We want a balance to the programming that is all too often given them the label, what many people sort of throw around saying National Pentagon Radio. I think NPR is better than that. I think it can be national public radio. And I think that we protect it by organizing and letting your NPR station know that you want to hear a diversity of voices. It was not only the New York Times that so minimized that first protest and said a couple thousand people are out and were forced to do a almost full-page correction 3 days later. It was also NPR, where one of the reporters said there are less than 10,000 people here. They were forced to put a correction on their website and repeat it through the week. It is because people said, we want accurate reporting. We don't want the propaganda. And I really do think that it matters and that there are many people within National Public Radio, many of them trained at Pacifica radio stations, at community stations, at WORT here in Madison, Wisconsin. And we have to celebrate the home right here, where we are, and it is the home of community radio WORT and also WYOU Public Access TV, not to mention the ND Media Center. We can let them know what we want to hear on our stations. So I certainly think that they can be our media as well.
I'd like to add one thing, especially apropos of talking about solutions. NPR is the best we can get when we don't have real publicly funded radio. It's deliberately underfunded, so it's forced to scramble for corporate funding. It's not the BBC, it's not The Guardian. The BBC is actually publicly funded, and that's one of the things we should really be thinking about this weekend. How do we push for publicly funded national media in this country?
Just keep in mind there are other publicly funded media, namely Iraq Media Network, funded publicly by the Department of Defense, Pentagon, Radio Sawa, Radio Farda, Voice of America. These continue to be funded by us, so we also need to talk back to these media. I just wanted to thank the panelists again. I hope we got your juices flowing a bit, and keep supporting independent media, public access media. Great job.
Just as their anger is refractory. Just as their anger is highly refractory and resistant to change, their reputations are refractory and resistant to change. It's hard to change staff perceptions with regard to people having serious anger and violence problems. And justifiably so, because their colleagues have had their careers ended by people's explosive anger and violent behavior. And you've got somebody that's attacked staff members 6, 7, 8, 9 times a year and is in the hospital because they've committed murder. And the devil is telling them this and that, and they're hearing voices coming out of the toilet and the walls, and you're in collusion with the CIA and so on and so forth. Despite all of those delusional systems, despite the paranoia and the recognition of the mental disorder, the fact is that that individual has assaulted staff members. Now, progress is being made. They're becoming less acutely disordered. They're becoming more calm. They're behaving in ways which are consistent with treatment progress on the anger and aggression domain, but nonetheless, there is the recollection and the memory of this person's explosive behavior. And females, as I'll show you data, are just as assaultive. In fact, more assaultive. Females in long-standing, long-term institutional care environments are more assaultive than males. It's not just a male thing. Now, what I'm saying, going off on an elaboration here, but resistant to change here as well are staff perceptions of angry people. We encourage the moderation of anger intensity. We raise the salience to them of the cost of anger, work hard to build trust in the therapeutic relationship, and model and reinforce effective non-anger alternative responding. It's the continuance of threat perceptions that is always there linked with anger. I'm expendable, I'm the problem, I don't matter to them. If I could let my guard down, somebody's going to get me. Anybody could be the enemy. If I screw up, somebody dies. Those threat perceptions are ever present. I wanted to go into anger systems, and I think because that does take a fair amount of time. Well, look, let me show you some bits on this. This takes a long time to elaborate, but I would like some of you to at least recognize where my thinking has gone over the years. Look, I've said anger is a contextual and dynamic phenomenon. And some key concepts in the systems domain are embeddedness. That is, anger experiences are embedded or nested in overlapping systems, such as the family, the job, the work organization, the regional economy, and social cultural values. Adaptation. It's grounded in long-term adaptations to things, to internal and external demands, and a range of environmental fields from the biological to the sociocultural. The causes, experiences, and sequelae of anger are reciprocally influenced. There's interdependence between the anger experiences and what happens in conjunction with them, which then can revivify the anger. Anger is triggered by external and